In the middle of the night, the phone rang, and a single voice said to me in an eerie calm, "I can see you right now." I laughed at first, until it went on to tell me details I haven't shared with a single soul. A few minutes later, I started hearing footsteps around me, even though I was completely alone in the building. And the moment I looked up at the camera, I saw something standing behind me, something that shouldn't have been there at all. In the mid-autumn of 1994, when I was in my early 20s, I made the decision to start a new life in a damp, mountainous town nestled in the outskirts of the German province of Bayern. I needed a temporary source of income for a few months, so I accepted a position as a night receptionist at an old, isolated wooden lodge. It sat on the edge of a dense pine forest and featured a small, rarely operating freight train station attached to it. During the day, the place buzzed with ordinary activity: maintenance workers, truck drivers, and the atmosphere was dull but reassuring. After sunset, however, everything turned upside down. The hours stretched with a deadly weight, and the glass-fronted reception lobby became excessively bright, while a pitch-black darkness swallowed everything outside the windows, leaving you with a creepy feeling that every passerby carried a dark secret behind their features. That extraordinary night was my last shift alone for the week, a night whose details haunt my dreams to this day. The lodge's protocol required locking the front glass doors and the railway gate at exactly midnight. Around 9:30 p.m., as the stillness of the mountain enveloped the place, the ring of the old landline phone on the reception desk shattered the silence. I picked up the receiver mechanically without thinking, but the moment I placed it to my ear, the blood froze in my veins. I didn't hear a normal voice, but rather a damp whisper, low and unnaturally drawn out, as if coming from the throat of someone trying with forced theatricality to imitate psychopathic killers from old cinematic movies. Although the voice initially sounded artificial and exaggerated, like a parody, the tone carried a chilling coldness that sent shivers down my spine. The whisper asked me in a slow cadence, "Are you alone in that glass cabin?" I fell silent for a few seconds in disapproval, then answered mockingly, trying to conceal my nervousness, "Yes, you caught me," before slamming the phone down violently. The only logical explanation that crossed my mind was that one of my friends in the neighboring town was playing a prank on me. I immediately opened our handheld radio and sent a message to our group chat, mockingly asking about the idiot calling the lodge, pretending to be a serial killer hunting down victims. Their replies came quickly, filled with laughter, and they all feigned confusion. One swore he had been tucked in a bed for an hour, and another confirmed he was watching television with his family. I assumed, of course, that they were lying collectively, as that would be the natural expected response if they wanted to keep the foolish joke going. 10 full minutes passed in dead silence before the phone began to vibrate and ring once more. I picked up the receiver to find the same fake, cinematic tone waiting for me. This time, the voice coldly asked why I had hung up previously. I returned to my sarcastic shield and said, "Well, it seems you are a brilliant film director." At that point, the caller let out a low, muffled chuckle. It wasn't a mocking laugh as I had expected, but rather something real, bone-dry, and terrifyingly devoid of any human emotion. Then he muttered slowly, "It is rude to mock someone who possesses a precise reading of every single move you are making right now." I hung up the receiver for the second time, but this time I felt a heavy knot settle deep in my stomach. It might still be a joke for my friends, but the absolute calmness and freezing detachment of the caller bred an unease that escalated with every passing minute. I tried desperately to occupy myself and forget about it. Fortunately, a few late travelers began filtering into the lobby to book rooms, buy bottles of beer, or purchase local train tickets, granting my mind a temporary distraction. But every time the lobby cleared out and the stillness clamped back down on the space, my eyes would invariably dart back toward the wired phone. It rang for the third time at exactly 10:40 p.m. I lifted the receiver and instantly regretted it, as the voice asked point blank, "Does the train station always get this quiet and dead when midnight approaches?" That specific question felt like a stab into my artificial composure. Not a single word escaped my tongue. I hung up the wire, breathing heavily. I grabbed the radio device again and wrote to my friends, this time in a sharp, stern tone, emphasizing that the matter had crossed the line of a joke, becoming suffocating and unacceptable. I demanded to know who was behind this psychological torment. The collective denial came back again, but with a much more serious tone this time. I began contacting them one by one. One sent a live snapshot from his basement where he was repairing his bicycle. Another was with his fiancée in a cafe 30 minutes away from the station. At that moment, my fear morphed into a volatile mix of rage and confusion. I thought they might have hired a stranger to do this on their behalf. But the terrifying truth gnawing at my sanity was that the caller, despite never explicitly mentioning my name or the name of the lodge, was accurately describing the exact atmosphere of the station and the dwindling human activity just as it unfolded before my eyes. By 11 p.m., the calls began coming in rapid succession, heavily condensed. I stopped answering completely after the fifth call. The phone screamed with its continuous ringing while I stood paralyzed, staring at the handset, letting it stop on its own, only for it to ring again a minute or two later. This living hell persisted for roughly 15 minutes. I began flipping hysterically between the security monitor screens. There were 2 cameras monitoring the glass storefront and the outer pathway, and a third covering the back corner of the building. The lodge sat entirely alone on the bend of a mountain road, completely void of traffic at night. Behind the building, the pitch-black silhouettes of towering pine trees loomed next to a narrow, dark alleyway housing the iron trash dumpsters and shipping crates. The quality of the outdoor cameras was poor. They contained multiple blind spots, and the night feed appeared distorted and filled with shifting shadows. Even so, I kept cycling through the screens, half expecting to catch one of my foolish friends hiding behind the trees, phone in hand, laughing. But the screens displayed nothing but emptiness and gloom. Suddenly, I began to hear faint noises coming from outside. Noises that I initially tried to convince myself were mere illusions or the wind rustling through the trees. There was a low, rhythmic knocking somewhere on a wooden wall, followed by a thin, scratching sound scraping against the side warehouse wall, and finally, a dull thud from the back that sounded exactly like a heavy boot stepping on loose gravel. I reached a point where I could no longer ignore the danger. I sent a final message to the group chat, took a live photo of the empty, dark lobby around me, and wrote, "That's enough. This isn't funny anymore. I am terrified." They maintained their absolute denial, and one of my friends actually called me from his personal number to check on my safety. When I explained what was happening, his voice sounded genuinely confused and frightened. He swore he knew nothing about this prank and advised me to lock the doors immediately and end my shift early. Yet, a deceptive part of my brain was still trying to convince me that I was overreacting and that I would look foolish if I closed the lodge before my official hours. At around 11:40 p.m., the final customer stepped into the lobby. I remember the exact ring of the brass doorbell because it made me jump in sheer panic. I looked up to see a man who appeared ordinary at first glance, perhaps in his late 30s. There was nothing overtly wild or crazed about his appearance. His clothes were neat and clean, and he wore no mask or suspicious gear. But what froze the blood in my veins was his facial expression. It was entirely vacant of any human emotion, a face as rigid as wax. He didn't utter a greeting. He simply bypassed the reception desk and began wandering slowly through the aisles dedicated to selling supplies and snacks. I watched him closely on the security monitors while feigning to sort paperwork in front of me. He took an absurdly long time for someone who ended up choosing a single bag of chips. He drifted from one aisle to another with slow, dragging steps, then would stop dead in his tracks for several seconds. In more than one frame, I could see the upper half of his face and eyes appearing over the edge of the high shelves, fixing his dead gaze directly onto me. It wasn't the look of a customer searching for an item. It was a cold, calculating evaluation, as if he were studying me and testing my reactions. I tried to convince myself that he was perhaps under the influence of a substance, or exhausted from travel, but a heavy, suffocating weight gripped my stomach, as if my body had sensed the danger and processed the nightmare before my conscious mind could admit it. He remained wandering for at least 9 full minutes before finally approaching the wooden desk, placing the bag of chips in front of me. He didn't speak a word, so I matched his silence. I simply took the chips and scanned them. While I looked down at the cash register screen, everything felt normal for a split second. But the moment I raised my eyes, I caught him staring directly into my eyes. He held that unreadable, statue-like gaze for about 2 full seconds. 2 seconds might not sound long, but in that dead silence, it felt as though we were standing in the lobby of time for a century. There was no trace of expression on his waxen face as he did it. Then he looked down, paid the cash, took his bag, turned around, and walked with measured steps toward the exit door. I remember breathing a sigh of relief for a moment, thinking that I had merely succumbed to a mild bout of paranoia triggered by those anonymous phone calls, and that the man was just an eccentric traveler. However, the exact moment he reached the glass door and pushed it halfway open, he stopped completely. With a sudden, spine-chilling motion, he snapped his head back around toward me, without turning his entire body. His chin was lowered slightly toward his chest, forcing his eyes to look up at me from beneath his brows. Then, agonizingly slow, a wide grin spread across his lips. To this day, I still don't know how to explain that smile without sounding dramatic. It was a distorted, overly wide grin that implied he knew exactly how terrifying he looked in that moment, deliberately doing it to shatter whatever remained of my composure. I stood there like a statue, every single hair on my body standing on end. He stepped outside, and instead of walking toward the parking lot or the main street, he turned and walked right along the side glass facade of the lodge, keeping his fixed eyes and that terrible grin locked onto me through the glass, until the brick corner cut off my view of him. The second he vanished, I rushed to the monitor screen in a frenzy to track him. I saw him round the back corner of the building and head at a fast pace toward the pitch-black corridor of the pine forest. Then, with a single step, he vanished completely into the blind spot of the rear camera and never re-emerged. I waited 10 seconds, then 20, then a full minute, staring blankly at the screen, but the shadows never birthed his body back, nor did he exit from the opposite side. That was enough for me to make the executive decision to lock the lodge immediately, even though it was a few minutes before midnight. This might sound cowardly, but I sent rapid text messages to my family and friends, writing, "There's a creepy stranger surrounding the building, and I am not joking. If I stop responding to you after a few minutes, know that something bad has happened to me because of him." I began the closing procedures at a hysterical speed. I didn't wipe the tables or arrange the shelves. Instead, I kept bouncing my eyes back and forth to the camera screens every few seconds, fully expecting to see his waxen face pressed against the front glass at any moment, but nothing appeared. Midnight arrived, and I knew that staying for another second in this glass cage would make me lose my mind. I grabbed my duffel bag, killed the auxiliary generators, and headed to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped quickly outside. The seconds it took to reinsert the key and lock the heavy iron door from the outside under the thick fog were the most nerve-wracking, terrifying moments of my life. I could practically feel his fingers reaching for my neck in the gloom. The moment the lock clicked, I took off at a full sprint toward my car, which sat in the dark side lot of the station. I covered most of the distance in seconds, and just as I reached the car door and slowed down for a fraction of a second to pull out my keys, a rapid, sudden sound of footsteps pierced the silence of the night. It wasn't a run, but somehow it was far worse. It was the sound of aggressive, fast-walking, heavy boot heels slapping the asphalt sharply, coming from the front corner of the shop. I turned around in pure panic and saw him. It was the man himself. He had emerged abruptly from behind the front corner of the building and was marching toward me in my car at a terrifying speed with wide, rapid strides. I yanked the car door handle, threw myself inside, locked the automatic doors instantly, and turned the ignition with a frantic rush that nearly flooded the engine. The second the car started, I slammed it into gear and tore out of that lot, leaving behind a cloud of flying gravel. I looked once and final time into the rearview mirror and saw him standing there under the dim light of the station, rigid as a statue, watching my car with his eyes as it disappeared into the mountain darkness. The entire drive home under the light rain, I was sending shaky voice notes and text messages to everyone, emphasizing that my fears were real, that this monster had materialized out of thin air to catch me, and that none of it was a joke. The next morning, I contacted the lodge manager and detailed the horrific sequence of events from that night. However, his subsequent reaction infuriated me and made my blood boil. He handled the situation with a cold, defensive attitude, telling me after reviewing the footage that the man looked like a normal traveler looking for supplies to him. He claimed that the anonymous phone calls had probably triggered my panic, causing me to connect unrelated dots to fabricate an imaginary conspiracy. That dismissal enraged me beyond words. He wasn't the one standing there in the dark. He wasn't the one receiving those quiet threats. And he wasn't the one who saw that distorted smile vanish only to come rushing out of nowhere toward him in an abandoned parking lot. I didn't care if the grainy camera lenses failed to fully capture the sense of danger and pure malice, because I was there and I knew exactly what happened. I handed him my resignation that very day without further discussion, bitterly telling him that if he thought this was normal, he could welcome himself to work the closing shift alone. Despite the many years that have passed since that incident, my conviction remains absolute that the muffled whisper over the phone and the owner of the wax and smile were the exact same entity, even if I could never legally prove it. It was just past 2 a.m. in the autumn of 1978 when I sat behind the wooden reception desk at the isolated Blackwood Lodge, nestled on the edge of a deserted mountain road in the coastal highlands of Aberdeen County. The place was no luxury hotel. It was merely an old inn with dark timber walls that smelled of pine and dampness, frequented by local miners and truck drivers seeking a warm shelter to sleep. My name was Oliver, a young man in his mid-20s. I had accepted this night job because the pay was rewarding compared to the quietness it afforded me for my studies. I had learned how to deal with all types of guests, the exhausted travelers, the chatty ones, and those who would simply drop their keys and walk to their rooms in absolute silence. Weekends saw some movement, but the real issue with midweek shifts was that I was left entirely alone to manage the massive building, without a security guard or a maintenance worker to share the loneliness of the night. Because of the remote nature of the place, I was always vigilant, constantly scanning the corners of the lobby for fear of intruders. It was for this reason that I immediately noticed that man's entrance. The clock read 1:15 a.m. on Tuesday when the heavy wooden door swung open. If I were to guess his age, I would say he was in his late 40s, but he possessed an extreme elegance and was groomed in a way that did not match the rough, rustic nature of this country at all. He wore a turtleneck wool sweater under a long, dark brown leather coat. His clothes were expensive but without ostentation, and he surrounded himself with an aura of sophistication and still dignity that spoke of immense wealth and real influence, not the loud type that flaunts itself. He scanned the lobby slowly, then advanced with confident, straight strides toward the reception counter and sat on one of the leather stools. I remember that his posture was rigid, carrying a strange military bearing, but I paid no attention to it at the time. When I approached him, he looked at the guest ledger before me and requested a reservation for the upper suite overlooking the forest, without even asking about the price. As I was preparing his room key, he looked at me with a calm smile and asked in a steady tone whether I found pleasure working here all alone in the midst of this isolation. It was a question that seemed typical of a curious traveler, so I answered him honestly and smiled back, trying to show friendliness, even making a light joke about being the faithful guardian of this wooden fortress. I wish I could say that I felt some malicious intent emanating from him at that moment. But the truth was that he exuded completely positive energy, like a decent family man exchanging pleasantries with dignity. We chatted for a few minutes, and I didn't mind it at all since silence was blanketing the place and there was nothing to occupy me. Suddenly, the course of the conversation shifted when he leaned in slightly and asked in a low voice, Have you never thought of leaving this place and doing something more valuable that would bring you a real fortune? I confess the question was strange and abrupt, but given the quiet atmosphere, it didn't seem entirely terrifying. I put on my usual professional smile and told him that I was completely satisfied with my current situation until I finished my studies. He nodded slowly, took a sip from the glass of water in front of him, and a vague look of disappointment appeared on his face, one I did not understand the reason or motive for at that exact moment. After a heavy, puzzling silence, he caught me off guard with another question. At what time exactly does your shift end and you get replaced by the next employee? This question made me a bit wary. I caught no trace of friendliness or passing curiosity in his tone, and I felt frustrated because our friendly chat had turned into another suspicious attempt to interfere with the operational security of my job. I smiled cautiously and gave him a vague, elastic answer, trying to deflect his attention diplomatically and without rudeness. Before he could utter another syllable, I pretended to be busy organizing the logs and wiping the surface of the counter, but he did not press for an answer. He simply smiled coldly, as if he had already deduced what he wanted to know. Then he stood up, pulled out a large banknote, placed it on the counter as an extra tip, and without saying goodbye, turned around and walked out into the swirling fog outside. I didn't really know how to interpret this bizarre encounter. His behavior was so far out of the ordinary that it aroused both my curiosity and my anxiety. In any case, I assumed he was just a passing traveler whose path I would never cross again, and I went on with my work. But I was entirely wrong. About a week later, the very same man returned to the lobby. Except this time, he was not alone. A woman accompanied him. She caught my attention immediately because her features were completely unfamiliar in these parts. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, wearing a velvet coat and bright colors that did not suit the dignity of her age or the cold mountain weather at all. She looked like someone trying far too hard to blend in and mimic the appearance of much younger girls. I watched them intensely through the reflection of the glass as they advanced toward the counter. Every movement she made seemed calculated and precisely executed, from her exaggerated smile to the way she leaned against the wooden desk as if we were old friends. Before I could welcome them or ask about the purpose of their visit, the woman preempted me with a statement that was neither a greeting nor a request for a reservation, but rather a suspicious compliment. Fixing an overly cheerful smile on her face, she said in a hushed tone, "Son, your features are strong and you look very intelligent." The tips of her fingers brushed my arm slowly as she spoke, lingering there a bit longer than usual. I stepped back a pace in disapproval and thanked her dryly, as I instantly sensed that something was amiss regarding this woman and her scrutinizing gaze. As for the man, he remained completely silent this time, which I found strange and entirely contradictory to his talkative nature from the previous encounter. They asked for the key to their old room, and the moment I handed it to them, questions began pouring from the woman's mouth like a flood. She asked about the duration of my employment at this inn, my age, my family, and a series of other personal questions. I answered with extreme brevity and short, polite sentences, feeling that this was no casual small talk. She was studying my physical build and facial expressions. At one point, she darted a quick glance at the man, and it seemed to me that they were exchanging unspoken, silent signals that I did not understand. The woman leaned further over the counter, lowering her voice to a whisper that was almost hidden from the rest of the lobby, and told me that she managed a private, exclusive events company for the elite in the capital. She added, her eyes gleaming with a strange brightness, that she was always looking for sharp, strong-looking young men to work as private hospitality staff and security at closed parties, and that I would make a fortune of £10,000 in a single weekend. I let out a dry, forced chuckle and told her flatly that the offer sounded too fantastic to be true. But she insisted in a sharp tone on the truth of her words, asserting that many young men my age worked for them and had achieved financial independence. That waxen smile never left her face throughout the conversation, which began to stir terror and suspicion deep within me. I tried to redirect the conversation toward booking the room and the job, but she kept circling back to the same terms: safe work, influence a special holiday. Then she said, suddenly, with a terrifying casualness, "You should step out to the parking lot with me for a moment. There is someone sitting in the car outside who can explain the details of the contract to you much better." At this point, my heart began to race violently, and a genuine panic seized me. The situation could no longer tolerate pretending to be calm or humoring her. I looked directly into her eyes and said in a firm voice, "I am content with my job here, and I am not going outside." All signs of politeness vanished from my face this time. In those critical seconds, the outer door opened and a group of rowdy local miners walked in, laughing and talking loudly. In the blink of an eye, the expressions on the woman's face shifted, and her fake mask of friendliness dropped, replaced by a cold detachment. She turned to the man, and without uttering a single word, the two of them turned around and left the inn, hurrying out into the darkness. I would be lying if I said I wasn't deeply shaken and agitated after they left. It was obvious that these strange individuals were trying to lure me into something dark. As soon as the day's shift arrived, I informed my colleagues and the inn manager in terrifying detail about what had happened, and we all agreed to tighten surveillance and keep our eyes open in case this suspicious duo returned. The manager reassured me, confirming that he lived in a house only 15 minutes away by car and that I could call him at any time, adding that the security cameras surrounding the inn were enough to deter any aggression. There wasn't much more I could do, as those people hadn't actually committed any punishable crime yet. I tried to banish the dark thoughts from my mind, but a few nights later, specifically after locking the doors at midnight, I spotted that car. It was idling across the street from the inn, its engine and lights turned off, sitting there in the darkness like a stalking phantom. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing but a coincidence, but the feeling of being watched and preyed upon crawled over my skin like static electricity. When my shift ended and I walked toward my car in a back lot, I kept my head down, clutching my keys tightly between my fingers. As soon as I drove out onto the highway, I checked my rearview mirror. To my absolute horror, the car began to move and followed me. It kept a sufficient distance behind to avoid throwing up suspicion, but with every random turn I took along those winding, dark mountain roads, it remained behind me like my shadow. I took an abrupt turn into a dark side street, and the very same headlights followed me. At this point, panic completely overwhelmed me, and I realized I was a target. I forced my mind to stabilize for a few seconds, headed directly and at maximum speed toward the bright lot of the county police station, and gripped the steering wheel with a force that turned my knuckles almost white from the sheer pressure. The second I swerved into the illuminated parking lot of the police station, the other car sped off and vanished into the mountain brush. Days passed after that incident in complete silence, and it did not happen again, so I thought the nightmare was over and that they had backed off out of fear of the police. But days proved me wrong. On a slow, freezing winter night in the middle of the week, when activity had completely died out and not a single guest had entered the inn, right at midnight, just as I was preparing to close the ledgers and leave early, I heard the creak of the front door opening. I raised my head, and there she was, the very same woman, standing at the threshold, staring at me with that same artificial, waxen smile. In the most inconspicuous way possible, I slipped the handheld radio from my belt and transmitted a coded distress signal to my manager. The woman advanced with slow, measured steps toward the reception desk and sat down, folding her hands tightly over each other. I was hesitating to demand that she leave immediately when she initiated coldly. "I thought I'd come check on you and your decision." My stomach began to twist violently, but I exerted all my energy to hide my terror. I told her firmly that the inn was closed now and that she had to leave immediately, but she furrowed her brows in a fake pout and requested a room for the night, asking for a cup of hot tea. I thought of a flat refusal, but my mind deduced that processing the reservation and preparing the tea would take enough minutes for my manager, who lived close by, to arrive. So, I turned my back to her and began preparing the paperwork and the cup, trying to maintain my composure. Suddenly, that sound sliced through the silence, the soft, unmistakable metallic click of the front door being locked from the outside. I spun around quickly and hysterically toward the seat, only to be struck with horror. The woman had completely vanished from the lobby. I felt a dreadful void hollow out my chest as I advanced toward the glass door. Through the glass, under the dim light, I saw the ultimate nightmare. A massive black truck was idling out in the lot. Without a second thought, I slammed the internal iron bolt of the door shut as fast as I could. At that exact microsecond, the handle of the back kitchen door began to shake violently. Someone else was attempting to breach the building from the rear. And blind panic seized me, and I found nothing before me but a heavy metal container which I snatched from the table to hold as a defensive weapon, while dialing 911 with my other hand. I knew the police wouldn't arrive in time to save me, and I was preparing to fight a life-or-death battle when the darkness of the outer lot was pierced by the headlights of a car that sped frantically into the yard. It was my manager. The moment his headlights struck the building, the loud noises at the back door ceased abruptly, and a few seconds later, the black truck tore out of the lot, its tires releasing a deafening screech as it vanished into the mountain darkness. I was trembling as I hugged my manager and explained what had happened. Catching his breath, he told me that he had managed to log the license plate numbers of the truck as it fled. When the police arrived minutes later, the manager reviewed the inn's security camera footage with the detectives. The grotesque, horrifying revelation was far worse than anything I could have imagined in my darkest nightmares. In the minutes preceding the woman's disappearance, the cameras caught two masked individuals crouching in the pitch darkness right along the front door, waiting for me to step out. At the exact same time, a third individual was banging violently on the back door as a diversion. The plot was designed so that the banging at the rear would trigger my natural flight instinct to run out of the front door, landing me straight into the arms of the two masked men waiting in the dark to liquidate or abduct me. It was a terrifying, tactically planned operation carried out in cold blood. To make the picture even darker, subsequent police checks proved that the license plate number my manager had recorded was fake, belonging to a junk truck that had been dismantled years ago. Many years have passed since that ill-fated night, and the investigations have never made any progress or uncovered the identity of that network to this day. The only positive outcome from this terror is that the inn's management permanently banned leaving any employee alone on night shifts. Even so, a suffocating feeling of unease and paranoia attacks me every time my name is put on an evening shift schedule. I still ask myself, and my mind fails to find an answer. How did they know with such precision that I would be entirely alone on that specific night? The matter seems impossible without a traitor watching from the inside. Even now, when I lie in bed, I shiver with terror whenever I think of what would have happened to me had I surrendered to my panic that night and run straight out of the front door.